Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Renewable Energy and Climate Talk, or REACT by PECC. I'm Emma Lagle, the Energy Policy Advisor here at the PACE Energy and Climate Center. We're joined today by Clara Cusanelli, who has been PECC's legal intern for this fall semester. And we're really excited. I've gotten, some really great opportunity to work closely with Clara this semester on kind of two areas specifically. She's been supporting our work on preparing municipalities for exploring thermal technology projects, particularly thermal energy networks, and has engaged in some areas of research around state support for those types of projects. And she's also assisted us in some public comments that we made earlier this fall on the draft state energy plan here in New York State. So we'll be kind of covering those areas and those topics, and kind of getting some feedback from Clara as a current law student, getting to kind of work on some of these issues for the first time. Others have some background in, but really to hear from her on how this experience has been and some lessons she's going to be taking away about working in energy law and policy in New York State. So with that, we'll welcome Clara. It's great to have you with us today.
Thank you.
So I think we should jump right in. I think I already kind of teed up a bit that your work has really asked you to look at some of the agencies here in New York State and how they are supportive of different renewable energy projects and technologies, specifically thermal. Could you talk a bit about from your perspective, after this semester, the role of state agencies in expanding renewable energy, specifically thermal?
Yeah, so there's a lot that's going on in New York State. There are different state agencies. Two kind of agencies that we looked really closely at were NYPA and NYSERDA in New York, and they have brought a lot of different programs in the clean energy space to New York residents. So, for example, the Clean Heat for All program focuses on putting heat pumps in New York public housing buildings, which has, really directly brought the clean energy movement to these residents, to people who might not otherwise be able to afford this transition up front. And they've just seen immediate results with these heat pump installations. Residents have seen their costs going down. They've seen temperatures be more comfortable in their apartments. So that's just a really encouraging program that we're hoping will just keep expanding to more public housing projects, but also, other buildings in the state. Another really great program has been the R.E.A.C.T program, which stands for the Renewable Energy Access and Community Help. And it diverts revenue from energy projects to fund clean energy projects for lower income residents across the state. And that's also, like I was saying, just a really great way that that state agencies have tried to, contribute to this upfront cost of the transition, which, ultimately reduces costs in the future, which is really important for lower income residents in New York.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that Clean Heat for All program, that was a NYPA program, correct? And so I know that we kind of explored, NYPA's offering specifically for thermal. What were some of the kind of takeaways about their kind of offerings? I think at this point for other NYPA customers, potentially, outside of New York City, because I remember, that Clean Heat for All wonderful program in public housing in New York City, but they're also exploring this idea of networked thermal and how they can be supportive of their customers kind of statewide, right?
Yeah, there are a lot of other chances too for people outside of just public housing. NYPA offers free heat pump screening for all of their customers, which they'll send out, an expert to take a look at the property, take a look at kind of the building envelope and see, what kind of heat pump could be installed, if that's feasible for the property. And they also work with their customers at cost, which includes, municipalities, agencies, schools, and hospitals. So, not even just their customers, other places as well, at cost to implement clean energy systems.
Yeah. And I think that, it's this interesting example of the situation, the current kind of moment that we're in New York, where, the program that we've been working on is supportive of local governments, right? Exploring these technologies and exploring, initial projects. But at the same time, right, these state agencies are also exploring. So everyone's kind of in this transitional period together, which I think, leads me to a follow-up question, kind of a secondary question, because in addition to the thermal work, right, and you also were able to, do some research and support our center's comment to the draft state energy plan earlier this semester. And so, I think there's been a couple opportunities to kind of see, right, this state agency administrative process and to engage with it. And I wondered about whether you have any thoughts on how, everyday New Yorkers, obviously, we're in this space academically, professionally, but this is also a space that belongs to, everyone. And there's different ways for the public to engage. And I think that you've had some opportunity to kind of learn something about that. So, some thoughts on how, everyday citizens, New Yorkers can engage in statewide energy planning and, advancing renewables.
Yeah, it's just so important for people to get involved. This process, more than anything, has just taught me kind of how accessible it is. I'm coming into law school, I hadn't really participated that much. I didn't know how accessible it really was. And as you said, even though we're doing these public comments from, a university, scholastic area, it's, just really taught me how, as long as you're passionate and, states open up a public comment period for a reason. They want, feedback so they can make sure that these laws are helping as many New Yorkers as they can. So it's just so important, whether an individual, a group of, it doesn't have to be law school students. It can be, anyone in the community, anyone in the state that's, interested, or it can be, a more organized group, a community group, law students, anyone from, any type of, interested, anyone who has a stake in these laws. Right. And it doesn't even have to be as formal as, a public comment at the local level. A really great way for people to get involved in, the clean energy transition is through, citizen-led groups in their, locality that can inform the local government. You can also just make sure that you're voting in your local elections, that, they might not be, the giant interesting issues at the federal level, but it's important to, see that, these local elections are really informing how municipalities are moving forward. Mm-hmm. And I will also just say that in terms of comprehensive planning and other plans that, go on in municipalities, by law, those processes have to be inclusive. So they want your input, they want your participation in those processes. So, if your town, if your municipality is, going through a planning process right now, it's, they want your voice, and they'll be so happy if you reach out and want to get involved in that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that you definitely are articulating, I think, some very important takeaways that I was hoping, that you would get from your work with the center, and speaking some, very powerful truths where I think that engaging in this space can seem daunting, and then it's like riding a bike. I think once you start to do it, you start to learn, how to track when public comment opportunities are happening, when regulations are being, drafted and proposed by the state, and when the opportunity comes to dig into them. I think it's also important to kind of urge people who, reach out to groups like the PECC Energy Center, right? Reach out to either local, regional nonprofits that are doing this work, because, we are so supportive of, more people getting involved in any opportunity to, have their voices heard in the development and kind of process of, trying to push renewable energy forward in a day and age when, it's not the landscape we had even a year ago. And so when things are, more difficult, it helps to have as many people engaged to kind of, share that, messaging and kind of keep each other hopeful in a way. But yeah, I think that your points as well about, the kind of differentiation between what local engagement and then like state and federal engagement looks like. And, obviously local planning is a community effort. And at the same time, so is development of state law and regulation, right? So, I think it's easier for folks to remember the local side, but don't forget that like it's your state, it's your government. Like engagement is, the pathway to have your voice heard. And yes, elections are important. Go vote next year or for special elections. But, this administrative process that happens at all three levels of the government is continuous. It's ongoing. So there are countless ways for people to get involved that aren't just, election night. So I think it'd be good to take a step back and talk about maybe this kind of example of, the legislative regulatory development process that kind of includes all three levels of government and, some of the, I think, feelings and thoughts we're having due to like a recent change in it. So for folks, watching, I'll set a little context. As part of our work on this thermal energy project, right, preparing municipalities, as best we can to, consider and move thermal projects forward. We are doing a session that will be taking place, just a couple of days after we're shooting this episode. And as part of that session, we're looking actually at the topic of community like planning. So we'll be covering right comprehensive planning, some lessons learned from service providers on what initial pilots are doing, considering zoning and like permitting approvals. But we're also going to be looking at a little bit of a niche kind of area of regulation, which is state building codes. It's a really fun area. But there is a process in the state where every 5 years the state code council updates what's called the state fire prevention and building code. And so every 5 years an opportunity comes around for the newest technologies to be integrated. I won't get too into the weeds around like, what the international code standards are that every 5 years the state automatically adopts. But what also happens every 5 years is any law that's been passed in that kind of previous, period that would have some effect on the code update has to be right integrated and part of the development of the new code update. And so that happened. And one of the specific, ways was that in 2023, New York State legislature passed a law called the All Electric Buildings Act. And this is a law that, if it came into effect, would make New York the first state in the country to, not allow new gas hookups or new fossil fuel heating and cooling sources for buildings, new builds, not renovations, not, even I think pretty kind of drastic renovations, but specifically for new construction. And the way the law was written was, starting end of 2025, December 31st, 2025, all buildings up to 7 floors that are new construction would have to be, right, all electric. In the 2 years that pretty much passed since the law was, signed by the governor in kind of spring of 2023, the State Code Council began its code update process. And, these elements of the All Electric Buildings Act were implemented and, a part of this, 2025 code update, which went through the Code Council's process, went through public comment. Again, this was a 2-year period, even after the signing of the law. And then, as of last week, we're about 2 months out from its implementation date, its effectiveness date. And then last Wednesday, there was some news. There's been a bit of a trend, which, again, we won't go too far into here, of, the kind of state dealing with a lot of different kind of pressures and factors, delaying, not moving forward under, required timeframes, different elements of New York State's climate law and some other, decarbonization legislation. So, what happened last week is there is litigation against All Electric Buildings Act, right? Not long after the law was signed, some plaintiffs who are, I think, representative of, kind of contractors, the folks that actually build our buildings, right, filed a lawsuit in federal court, basically claiming preemption. And, the state had more or less been, successful up to this point in the litigation. Like, they won the suit, and, the federal district court, Northern District of New York, up in Albany, had said, the state isn't preempted by the federal energy code, which doesn't, right, make new builds, have to be electric. But it appears that, by the state's own volition, they, through the litigation, have chosen to delay implementation. And they did so by jointly filing a stipulation with, right, the plaintiffs, with the builders and the contractors unions. And there's definitely, I think it's probably an interesting time for you to have been looking kind of into this right before this happened. Because, I think for a lot of folks who have been kind of in New York doing the work on, our climate law back in 2019, through the scoping plan, through today, the success of All Electric Buildings Act and the success of getting it implemented in full in the way it was into, the code update was a really exciting thing. And it had created a lot of, opportunity for certain technologies, industries, definitely thermal, definitely different, kind of building appliances and building materials that are, rated the highest for energy efficiency, right? So having this type of requirement is going to, promote those businesses and those industries and give the opportunity for them to scale and move closer to being the norm. And so now with this kind of litigation update, basically, the effectiveness of the All Electric Buildings Act is delayed indefinitely, basically until they go through all the appeal levels up to the Supreme Court. But, I know that was kind of a long-winded story, but I think it's important for folks to understand really the context here. But I really want to get your thoughts and reactions to this as someone who, is not only kind of studying administrative and, environmental law, but was, preparing to present on this. And now, it's kind of thrown everything for a loop, and kind of your thoughts.
Yeah, so in my head, there are a couple different layers to, what this delay means. On the municipality front, I mean, we're less than 2 months out from the December 31st effective date. So many municipalities in New York State, probably all of them, were, planning to have these changes implemented. And I won't go into it, but it's a long, long process to ensure that local codes are not less strict than state level codes. And there's a back and forth process there with the state of how to, make sure that municipalities can either keep or update their existing codes. So that's something that can go on, for weeks, months. So that is something, when that's delayed, municipalities have already expended a lot of resources to, try to plan for this act, and it being delayed, really, has set back maybe months of work for these municipalities. It also disrupts, planning from developers, industries, and just other, town employees who were, working to pivot and meet these new standards. And now it just kind of leaves them in limbo with their, future planning. And also just on a public level, it, creates, complicated messaging and clarity for the public. It leaves, New York citizens who may not have a professional stake, in this act, but just as citizens of New York, it leaves them with, unsurety with where their state stands on these kinds of issues, and, homeowners, renters, and what, to look forward in the future. And, it just complicates messaging from the state level for everyone, I think.
Yeah, and I think that, there was some verbiage in the filing that, is interesting when you think about it from the perspective of your points about, that this was done to preserve, regulatory certainty, or to minimize, the confusion. And I think that when statements like that are made, that it is like really important to be honest about for who. And I think, as you've pointed out, there are, a large group of not only stakeholders and activists, but industries and businesses who had been aware of these changes, were preparing for these changes, were well positioned to scale. Because I think one of the really important things that, when it comes to the transition, is that we need to scale the alternatives to the energy systems that we have now and the energy sources we have now. And the only way to reach a point where reliability is what we need it to be and supply is what we need it to be is to have the state law, policy, regulation to be continuously clear in its support of that. And so, this kind of 11th hour switch, there's definitely a question of alignment, I think, with those goals around what should, state regulation be doing, right, in terms of, the clarity. And when you say something is done to preserve regulatory clarity, but there's clear examples that for certain groups it doesn't, to be very honest about for who it preserves that clarity. And so I guess, given this uncertainty, right, at the state level, what does it make you think about how local laws and local planning are, important?
Yeah.
For the clean energy transition in New York, especially at this given moment.
Yeah. Well, just for the, All Electric Buildings Act itself, the municipalities that maybe were planning on these changes being implemented, there's, still a way, if those municipalities are interested in moving towards electrification, for them to, through supplemental energy codes, through comprehensive plans, through other types of plans, there's still an avenue for them to pursue this electrification standards, even if the state level isn't doing so. But just in terms of, clean energy at the local level in general, there's, as I was saying, you can have a supplemental building code, which a lot of municipalities in New York do. This, so every municipality has to adopt the state uniform code. That's every 5 years, as you mentioned, but there's also a way through home rule law in New York that they can kind of fill gaps in that state uniform code that, obviously the state code can't address everything for every municipality in the entire state. So there's a lot of room for municipalities to step in with their own laws to address the needs of their specific areas. And there's also opportunities for citizen involvement here, as I was saying, with the comprehensive planning process. There's just a lot of ways for citizens to have their voices heard where that might not happen to the same degree at the state or federal level.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think that this is a moment where if you folks are supportive of electrification, are aware of the red tape, of the barriers, that of course the state needs to figure those out, and probably needs a bit more time to do so, and is actively still trying to do so. But if you feel your local government should be trying to, I don't know if it's take a stance, but continue the forward movement and to continue positioning your community to be ready, and to be a bit ahead of maybe the curve now in New York, that it would definitely, I think, be appropriate to call your local leaders, call your state legislatures and your state representatives, and let them know, right, that you're supportive of all electric buildings, of moving us forward and actually implementing the laws that will help us make the shifts. Everyone, and I think law students start to learn this, but you pass a law, and then you have to successfully draft the regulations to implement that law. And then once you have the regulations, which codes are, you then have to change the game. You have to work on the ground. You have to work with industry, citizens, local governments to actually change the practices. Because you can write it on paper, you can make the law different, but how are people actually going to learn the new way? And I do think that this is an unfortunate example where there is so much overwhelm, I think, about that change, that you can get so close to those first two steps being done, but the overwhelm can politically, I think, cause a decision to kind of push that a little bit to the future, which I think is a good lesson to learn early on in your kind of legal policy career, because you then clearly see that once a law is passed, the game, it's just beginning, right? You have to stay in the fight for years to get all the way through that third step of actually transitioning. Change takes a very long time. And when it's something that you're changing from something that is easy and it's just what has been known, it is going to be particularly kind of continuous in that fight. So, however, our local governments are definitely, this kind of continued opportunity to at least see if you're, in your local community, there is the will, and some avenues towards still preparing development in your area to move towards all electric. So kind of transitioning a bit, I want to talk a bit about, I think, affordability, because I think that's something that we've talked about a lot in your time here. And I think it's probably the number one thing when you ask anyone about, energy or utility bills, it's, well, what does it cost, right? It's like, why are our rates so high? So I guess from your kind of perspective, thinking about affordability and quality of life, like, what do you think the clean energy transition could mean for New Yorkers, for like other, folks in America, particularly if, right, our leaders would step up and kind of minimize this kind of swing of political and policy support. What could it mean to have a successful clean energy transition?
Yeah, well, just starting with, New York specifically, I had mentioned before for New York public housing residents that are, getting these thermal energy systems put in right now. They've, in just a few months already been seeing reduced utility costs. They're already seeing more comfortable, more regulated temperatures in their places of living. And I think that's just indicative of the movement as a whole. We know that even though there might be larger upfront costs to this transition, in the long run, things will be cheaper. And I think that it's just, about shifting that psychology to investing in something in the upfront, which is unattractive to a lot of people. And it's just about, making sure that, we know the long-term benefits of this transition. But, and we've also just talked a lot about energy burden and how, higher income people might not even know what an energy burden is, but it's the idea that a percentage of your income should not be going to, well, a large percentage of your income should not be going to utility bills alone. And for lower income people, that is a very, harsh reality. A lot of their income tends to go towards their utility bills. And that is something that the clean energy transition can also help. And it makes sure that people's income is, it frees up them to, do other things with their income, pull themselves to different stations of life. So that's just also a really important part of the transition. It also just, for everybody in general, anyone who struggles with climate anxiety or, a sense of inaction, this transition will just make sure that people know that, this is a way for everyday people to do their part. Everybody uses energy, everybody needs to heat their home. It's something that involves everybody. Mm-hmm. And it's also just, from an independence standpoint, building more localized, renewable energy networks, thermal energy networks. You can have greater energy independence and you can, more tailor it to, the needs of a smaller locality. So with all those, I guess I'll just flip it back on you and ask you how you see affordability fitting into the clean energy future.
Those were great answers. And I think, all very much I would concur with. And I think for folks who haven't heard about energy burden, I will say that, it's this idea that, as Clara, pointed out, you can spend a too high percentage of your income on your energy costs. And, the kind of pie chart works that, the less you make, the greater that percentage. So, with low to moderate income households, the kind of policy goal that gets kind of talked about in New York and other states is 6% burden. There are definitely communities and areas in the state where folks are paying 25 up to 25%. We definitely have a higher average LMI energy burden here in New York than some other states. Mm-hmm. We have a very high number of households that are dependent on the federal LIHEAP program mm-hmm. through like the state HEAP program, which like many, social network, or programs are, is under threat at this point. And I think as we just learned over the last month, even if it's like formally maintained, there could be times when it's not available. And so how do I see affordability fitting into the clean energy future? I think that affordability and decarbonization and electrification go hand in hand. And I think that's really difficult for folks to kind of understand and even believe at this moment for a couple reasons. One is that utility bills keep going up, and utility bills keep going up 6 or so years after we've passed this climate law. And so it's given, stakeholders that don't want decarbonization, that don't want electrification, a great amount of ammo. And oftentimes these are stakeholders that have some deep pockets. And so they've been using that ammo to, kind of place, blame on decarbonization, on the implementation of the CLCPA here in New York, which is a distorted position at best. There are, at least half a dozen reasons for, increasing rates. One is that I can think of. One is that that's how our current utility rate-making system is structured and designed. Our existing utilities are not incentivized to, not build infrastructure that they can then get a rate of return on their investment on. So the structure that exists economically is that they're constantly looking to build more and get more money back. Inflation, right? Not not the responsibility of or the result of the CLCPA. Pipeline issues with materials that are also causing cost increases that then get kind of lumped into the rate calculations. Why are those happening? Pandemics, tariffs, again, not the CLCPA. You obviously have a very complex kind of regulatory permitting system. There's constant kind of need to discuss and evaluate the kind of power dynamics and responsibilities between the state and local governments and permitting and siting. And all of this has caused, continues to cause, kind of delays, additional costs. Maybe part of that's under the CLCPA, but that's also just how renewable permitting functions, how permitting any, project or utility infrastructure project functions. A bit of it, of course, is going to be that we have a bunch of clean energy projects and initiatives. One of the key elements of the CLCPA, Cap and Invest, which is supposed to inject like a fair amount of funding into the state to fund this transition, is another thing like the All Electric Buildings Act that is on pause, on delay. And so you have stakeholders that don't want this transition doing a really good job in different regions, across the state, blaming decarbonization and the decarbonization efforts for rate increases that primarily are a result of like just the business model, but that are also the result of all these compounding factors that are not right this law and these efforts. The other point I'll make is that thermal is a technology that we truly believe in. It's been proven to work on campus styles in downtown urban districts around the world. And yes, it has high upfront costs. Any new technology is going to have high upfront costs. Solar cost tenfolds what it costs now 20 years ago. So did wind. I think that, of course, it can be prohibitive if there isn't sufficient, state and federal support. We had the federal support. It's now been ended for many technologies. It actually has been maintained for thermal, geothermal, and other types of kind of ambient heat capture. But I want to make a point that I hope folks really think of. Yes, the costs are high. That is normal with, newer technologies that haven't scaled. But what a utility that's based on thermal would do is it wouldn't be based on this volatile economically volatile energy source. So the thing with natural gas, with oil, is that there's an element of the rate setting and the cost setting that happens by the producers of these natural gas, of these fossil fuels, right? So there are economic factors that like are way out of the control of even the state or even our federal government. And so these alternative energy sources, solar, wind, thermal, do not have that volatility. And that has been, I think, a continued part of the discussion that I don't hear talked about a lot when it comes to affordability, where it's like, yes, these projects and these new technologies are more expensive now, but what if 50 years from now, everyone is kind of not beholden to the greatest extent possible to these, fossil fuel sources that exist in an economic structure where like rates and costs are set by powers that be, by corporations, and that we here in New York and individual households have no control over. And I do think that long-term affordability will be dependent on creating alternatives for people to get their energy. Do you want it from what we have now, which utilities are structured to continue getting that rate of return, to continue wanting to get more money and higher rates to do so, that use energy sources that are not only emitting but like fossil fuel, natural gas emitting, but are based economically in a system with a lot of price volatility? Or do you want to try something different, right? Try to create alternatives that don't have that volatility, and that maybe are structured in a way where more funding, more of the rates are paid back into a community than to shareholders of an IOU. These are questions. I'm not answering these questions, but I think that they are important questions for future practitioners and everyday Americans to ask themselves about their energy and wanting it to be affordable. And so, yeah, I think I will say that we at PECC and myself, of all the issues, just making sure that in this transition, energy not only like stays reliable and affordable, but I would say becomes reliable and affordable, because it's not now. So, yeah. And so I think maybe we'll wrap up. What was your favorite part of the semester, do you think, of your work with PECC?
I think, everything was, so interesting. I was exposed to so much, and I had never done any work in energy law or clean energy, so this was just such a transformative experience to work with the center. But I guess the biggest thing that I'm taking away is just the exposure to decision-making processes. We talked a lot about our public commenting to state agencies, and as I said, that's something that I've never engaged in before, and being able to do it with, the perspective of a law student and, kind of with the support of a law school and a center at a law school, it was a really great, introduction to that. And I definitely see myself taking that into the future as an individual, but also other projects that I'm involved in. And also, with the comprehensive planning process, like I had talked about, it's not always what people think of. I'm sure, people who aren't involved in this space probably never think of their, town or city's comprehensive plan, but it's a really important, piece of municipalities, and it's a really great, easy way to get involved with, the decisions that go on in your town or city that you might want to voice on.
Great. And I will say that, working with you this semester has been a wonderful experience. And, there's some ways that you continue to show up that I think are important for, you as you continue on in your law school experience and into, your early career, and for other students entering the energy law and policy field, is, your eagerness to dive headfirst into something, even if it was new. Consistently asking, really pointed, high-level questions. And I think a part of that is not like, kind of pushing away the anxiety over, you might not think you understand something, but you probably, have a bit of a grasp more than you think. So ask those questions even if you think they sound stupid, because I promise you they don't. And, also your real interest on community level work. I would say that for anyone trying to kind of enter the energy space, communities and like speaking with households and just like everyday people about energy and really having an understanding of like what this like professionally is could be pretty complex specialized area. Like how does that translate into like how the public views this type of work and these utility systems, and to try to kind of center the people in as many ways as possible, because at the end of the day, we need to create a world that works best for everyone. And, we need energy systems that work for everyone, not just those that can afford it. So, yeah, I want to thank you for your time this semester.
Thank you.
And thank you all for joining Clara and myself for this third episode of R.E.A.C.T by PECC. We will be back in 2026 with even more student content, more practitioner content, and many more podcast episodes to come. So have a happy new year, happy holidays to everyone, and we'll see you next year.